And this is Henry.
Hello. And we are history detectives.
That's right, and today we're going to be history detectives looking at the life of King Alfred the Great. And we're asking, what was it made him so great?
You mean Alfred the Great? Who was he?
Well, Alfred was the King of Wessex.
Wessex? Do you mean Essex?
No, Wessex was the name of an old kingdom in England. There wasn't an England at the time. The place we know as England now was made up of several different kingdoms, each with its own king. Alfred was the King of Wessex. He fought against the Viking invaders and was the ruler of who united the Anglo-Saxons, or the English of today, and he was the king from 871 to 899 AD.
899? Sounds like a long time ago. Should we use the number line again?
We can do that. Would you like to do the adding up this time?
Me? Sure thing.
Right, if I come in very close, can you see what we're doing?
Okay, so we start off in our year of 1899. Then we're going to add 1 year to get us to 900.
Okay.
Then it should be simple enough to add 100 to that to get to the year 1000. From there, we can add another 1000 to get to 2000. And then, to get to 2021, we just add 21. So then, we add 1, 100, 1000, and 21 together, and that should give us 1122 years.
Wow, let me just do that. 1 and 1 is 2, 0 and 0 and 2 is 2. You're very good at maths, aren't you, Henry? 1 and 0 is 1, and 1 there. You're quite right there. You're a fabulous mathematician as well as a history detective.
Oh, shucks. So, how are we going to find out about him?
Well, there was a Welsh monk called Asa who wrote a life of King Alfred the Great. Now, he wrote a biography. Do you know what one of those is?
Yeah, but why don't you say it so I know that you do as well?
A biography is the story of somebody's life, but written by a different writer. Now, because Asa was at the time of King Alfred, and he wrote it at that time, that makes it primary evidence.
I remember that.
That's right. He was the first king to have such a well-documented life. It was almost like he had his own personal blogger. Shall we have a look?
Yeah.
In the year of our Lord 849, Alfred, king of the Anglo-Saxons, was born in the royal village of Wantage. He was extraordinarily beloved by his father and mother, and indeed by all the people, more than all his brothers. He appeared more attractive than his brothers, and he was more pleasing than they. His noble birth and noble nature gave him a love of wisdom above all things. But, with shame be it spoken, by the unworthy neglect of his parents, he was unable to read or write until he was 12 years old or more, though by day and night he was a keen and attentive listener to the Saxon poems. He was a practitioner of hunting with great success, for his skill and good fortune in this art and in all the other gifts of God were beyond those of everyone else, as I have often witnessed.
Well, Asa certainly thought Alfred was great.
Yes, but remember he was writing it for Alfred. If you were writing an essay about your school, you'd hardly be likely to write that my teacher's horrible and she's got a big nose, would you? But it is backed up with enough other evidence for historians to be able to rely on it as a good piece of evidence. Now, Alfred wasn't expected to become the king. He was the youngest of the 6 known children of Ethelworth, king of the West Saxons. After his father's death, Alfred's 3 elder brothers each ruled in turn, but they all have died before Alfred became the king in 871 AD. Now, during the reign of his brother Ethelred, Alfred fought by his side to push the Vikings back from Wessex.
Vikings? I like to play at Vikings. They came across from Norway and Denmark. Didn't they didn't they? And they sailed across the seas in longboats, looking for treasures. They were fierce and scary warriors.
Yes, well, by 870, the Vikings had taken over the rest of the country. As the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Wessex was under constant attack from the Vikings. Alfred and his brother Ethelred were at war almost all the time. Now, Asser writes about the battles with the Vikings. He calls the Vikings heathens because he was a Christian, and heathen was the name given to a non-Christian at that time. Let's see what he has to say about these battles.
In the year of our Lord 871, which was the 23rd of Alfred's life, the heathen army attacked Wessex. 4 days afterwards, King Ethelred and his brother Alfred, assembling an army, marched to Reading, where they fought bravely against the enemy, who, rushing like wolves out of every gate, waged battle with all their might. Both sides fought long and fiercely, but at last, sad to say, the heathen won. Roused by this, the king and Alfred returned to battle against the heathen army. Alfred, as I have been told by truthful eyewitnesses, marched up swiftly with his men to the battlefield, whilst the king stayed in his tent at prayer. The heathen, prepared for battle, had hastened to the field. Then Alfred, though only second in command, with the rush of a wild boar, courageously led the Christian troops against the hostile army, fighting for life and dear ones and fatherland. At the Battle of Edington, fighting fiercely against the whole heathen army, Alfred won the victory. After beating them, he chased them back to their fortress with all his army. 2 weeks later, the heathens, terrified by hunger, cold and fear, asked for peace.
The Wessex army didn't always win. Although they won some victories, at times they were driven back. Alfred himself was reportedly even captured one time. His brother Ethelred died after fighting one battle, and then Alfred became the king. He knew lots about fighting the Vikings and was well respected and very successful at it. Eventually, Alfred agreed a peace treaty around 880 AD with Guthrum, who was the Viking king in East Anglia.
So Alfred was a good fighter then, and clever in knowing when to make peace with his enemies. What else?
One raid, the Vikings sailed longships up the River Thames, so Alfred created a fleet of warships to prevent similar attacks in the future. You could say that he formed the first navy. Asser writes of several sea battles that Alfred fought against the Vikings. He also organised his army into a rota system, so that half his people worked on the lands to produce food, while the other half were trained in fighting. They changed every now and then, which meant that Alfred always had an army to fight and food to feed them, and the rest could be ready too if they were really needed.
Did he beat the Vikings then?
Well, the Vikings didn't really go away. The fighting continued on and off throughout Alfred's reign. But the West Saxons didn't suffer any further bad defeats, and by the time Alfred died, the Vikings were no longer a big threat.
Hooray for Alfred! What else makes him so great?
Well, Alfred loved learning for his whole life, and he knew how important it was for everybody. Asser tells a story of when he was a young boy that shows this.
One day, Alfred's mother was showing him and his brothers a book of Saxon poetry, which she held in her hand, and finally said, "Whichever of you can soonest learn this volume, I will give it to him." Stimulated by these words, and allured by the beautifully illuminated letter at the beginning of the volume, Alfred spoke before all his brothers. Though his senior in age, they were not so in grace, and he answered his mother, "Will you really give that book to that one of us who can first understand and repeat it to you?" At this, his mother smiled with satisfaction and confirmed what she had said before. "Yes," said she, "that I will." Upon this, the boy took the book out of her hand and went to his tutor and learned it by heart, whereupon he brought it back to his mother and recited it.
Alfred was great at learning things.
Yes, even before he could read, he learned all the poems in that book by heart by listening to his tutor and repeating them. It would have looked a bit like this.
Ooh.
When he was king, Alfred realised that the Viking raids had had a terrible effect on education in his country. You see, most teaching and writing books was done by the monks, and the Vikings had burnt and attacked all the monasteries, killing the monks who were the teachers and the scribes. So Alfred carried out a programme of education throughout his court, teaching both boys and girls to read, which was unusual for the time. He made sure everyone in his court was able to be educated. Alfred wrote a book, an amazing achievement for that time. He encouraged the monks to write a book called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which records the history of Britain up to that point. Alfred learned Latin and translated important books into Anglo-Saxon so that more people could read them. He had a book on leadership translated and sent to centres throughout the land, along with a jewelled pointer which was worth 50 gold coins. This is it here. It's called...
Beautiful.
It is lovely. It's called the Alfred jewel, and it was found in a field in Somerset, which is part of Wessex, in 1693.
That was not long after the Great Fire of London, wasn't it?
Yes, it's a long time ago for us, but remember that when it was found, it was 800 years after King Alfred's time. The inscription round the edge reads, "Alfred ordered me to be made," which connects the jewel with King Alfred the Great. Because it was made at the time and it was sent with the book to the monasteries, it is a primary piece of evidence and it's very important.
So Alfred was a great fighter and leader in battle. He was great at forming a navy. He had a great idea about making sure there was always an army and always enough food, and he was great at learning things and making books. Was there anything else that Asser wrote about it in his book, The Life of King Alfred?
Well, in 886 AD, Alfred freed London from the Vikings and became the dominant ruler of all the land, uniting the different kingdoms. He could therefore be called the first king of the Anglo-Saxons, which later became the English. Alfred established fortified towns throughout the kingdom to make sure the people were well protected. He invented a sort of a clock using a candle. He issued silver coins with his head on them. He was a very religious man and often prayed to God to help him in battle and to be a wise ruler. He also lived like a Christian, giving money to the poor and helping the church. Alfred wrote laws that helped his people and made sure they were judges that would treat the people poor fairly. He seems to have been a very kind and wise king, according to Asser, that is.
I know one thing he wasn't great at: baking cakes.
What do you mean?
Alfred the Great burned the cakes. Listen. King Alfred, exhausted, bedraggled and lost in the woods after beating the Vikings in a vicious pitched battle, stumbled upon the peasant's hut. The peasant's wife invited him in and, not recognising him, assumed he was merely a soldier of Wessex, never dreaming that it was the king who stumbled into her hut. She kindly offered him rest and food, as she had just baked some cakes, which were really bread rolls, into the embers of her fire to bake. The peasant's wife then popped out to collect more firewood and instructed the soldier to keep an eye on the cakes while she was away, in case they burned. Almost as soon as she left, poor Alfred fell asleep. A few minutes later, the housewife returned, greeted by the smell of burning cakes and a sleeping soldier. "What sort of careless, silly man are you? You can't even watch burning bread? You idiot, you dunce, you half-wit, you blockhead, you nincompoop, you... Never have I seen such a stupid, brainless, foolish, silly man. You don't even know how to watch ash-baked bread, and yet when it is put in front of you, you'll no doubt rush to eat it. Oh, yes, you will, you ninny, you chump, you dope, you nitwit." Can you imagine? She was telling off King Alfred the Great, and she didn't even know it.
That's a super story, Henry. But there's no evidence that Alfred actually burned any cakes during this period. The popular legend that Alfred burned a peasant's cakes while fleeing the Vikings was only written down 300 years after it was meant to have happened. Although I suppose maybe the story could have been passed down from person to person telling each other. There may be some truth in it. I mean, the story doesn't show Alfred in a particularly heroic light, does it? And the story doesn't have a moral to it like lots of made-up stories do, so there isn't really a reason for it to have been made up. What do you think?
The moral might be, don't fall asleep after a battle in case you burn the food.
There's another story that I like, of Alfred disguising himself as a minstrel and strolling into the Viking camp to play his tunes. He stayed there for several days and learnt lots about the Viking army, which he put to his advantage when fighting. So, history detectives, what did we learn today?
I learned that King Alfred really was great. But also, Alfred was strong in battle against the Vikings. He stopped them from taking over his kingdom of Wessex, eventually pushed them out and became king of the Anglo-Saxons. Alfred loved learning, and he made sure that others could learn too, through translating and writing books and encouraging teaching. Alfred was wise, good and a religious king who made improvements like fortified towns, the army rota and the navy that made his kingdom safer. He looked after poor people too.
Well done, Henry. You've remembered lots of things.
That actually wasn't King Alfred in those videos, was it? Was it Jake acting again?
Yes, it was. Did you recognise him?
Hello.
Would you like to see a craft that I've done? Do you remember the books of Saxon poetry and how Alfred was captivated by the illuminated letter? Well, this is what the books would have looked like in Anglo-Saxon times. The first letter of the book had this beautiful, beautiful letter that had been illustrated by the monks or whoever had drawn it. And it would have taken them weeks and weeks in order to do that. You can see on it there's lots of gold and bold colours and lots of detail. It really is a very beautiful thing, so I can see why King Alfred might have been captivated. So I had a go at making one of my own illuminated letters, and you can see I chose the letter H for you, Henry.
Aww.
And also for history detectives. So you can use whatever art material you've got, but I've used a variety here because I wanted to see what they all looked like. First of all, you need to draw your letter, and I've gone on around the outline there with felts, and then I've coloured in the middle with watercolour paints because I thought that was the best way. And then you just put lots and lots of detailed patterns on it, and you can do whatever you like, whatever comes to you. I've done lots of swirly things here with felt pens, and again, they were really quite easy to do and quite quick. You can see I've just gone swirl, 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 and then lots of different colours around. And I've tried different ones on different places just to see what worked well. And can you see, I've put a little hedgehog there as some detail because it's you, Henry, and you like that sort of thing.
I love it so much.
Now remember, there was lots of gold in the illuminated letters in the Anglo-Saxon books, so I don't know if you can really see, but I've used some metallic pens where I could, just to put a little bit of sparkle. Maybe glitter would work as well.
That would make it incredibly shiny.
There we go. So this is for you then, Henry.
Aww. Well, I think that's all we got time for now. High five, history detectives. See you all again soon.
Bye.
Bye.